The Audacity podcast is produced and sponsored by me and my company, DJoseph Design, over at djosephdesign.com, where you can get website design, presentation design, web hosting for your podcast site. I can create a site for you that's completely ready to host your podcast or even help you with your podcast production. Especially important to you, cover art for your podcast. Check out my portfolio over at djosephdesign.com and see how I can make your message look or sound great.
This is Fred Castañeda, your host of The Struggling Entrepreneur at www.strugglingentrepreneur.com and 12 other podcasts. And you're listening to The Audacity to Podcast with Daniel J. Lewis. Learn all about how you can make your audio better by listening to this podcast, which is part of the Noodle Mix Network at www.noodle.mx. So get ready to have the audacity to podcast.
Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 17. How long and how often should you podcast? Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel J. Lewis, also known as the Ramen Noodle. Check out the other podcasts over on the Noodle Mix Network. That's noodle.mx. We've got some awesome things there for you. And thank you, Fred, for giving me that bumper. Check out his podcast. We had a great conversation, and a conversation that we've recorded and I will be playing in a future episode. But in this episode, I have something to share with you. Many people will contact me and ask frequent questions. When you start getting interested in podcasting, a common question is, how long should my podcast be? How long should I even podcast? Like years, months, just a few weeks? And how often should you podcast? And I would say all of those answers are tied in to each other and relate to each other. How can that be? Because they depend upon each other. Just like many things in science depend on each other, how often you podcast and how long each episode should be depend on each other because of this. You don't want to be podcasting for an hour or several hours long every single day. Now, I mean a single show for every single day, hours of content. Do you know why? Your people won't be able to listen to it. If you are producing a 2-hour podcast every day, unless you've got extremely dedicated listeners who listen to only you, then you really shouldn't be podcasting for a long time. How long you podcast depends a lot on how frequently you podcast. My general suggestion is that your podcast should be between 1 and 90 minutes. I know that's a really long range there, very wide range, but it's very true because it depends on how often, the frequency of your podcasting. For example, like I said, if you're doing a daily podcast, then it's best to keep your podcasts shorter to make it easier for people to get every single day. Because if you're producing 2 hours of content and a person falls behind for 1 week, they're going to come back and discover they've got 10 hours to catch up on. They might not be able to catch up on it. And what are they probably going to do? Probably going to not unsubscribe, but probably delete those episodes that don't appeal to them, or just delete all the episodes they missed, depending on their perspective. Or they'll never get to listen to those episodes. They'll always be trying to catch up, and they might not get current with your episodes. So don't produce too much content, but also don't produce too little content. If you're doing a monthly podcast, then it's best not to have only 5 minutes of content because you're not providing much value. Monthly podcasts are okay. I've subscribed to several monthly podcasts like Children's Ministry Monthly over at cmmonthly.com. It's a monthly podcast. There have also been other podcasts such as Film Score Monthly is now Podfaded, I think. Soundtrack.net's podcast, now Podfaded, I think. And the Christian Comedy podcast seems to be Podfaded. They were monthly for a short time, but they've since kind of disappeared. So you have to make sure that if you're doing something monthly, still try to be consistent in your schedule. Don't just assume, well, whenever we get to it in the month, we'll be okay. Because if you do, then you're going to have a hard time getting to it within that month. As many monthly podcasters could tell you, is if they don't have it scheduled, it's very hard to get to it within that month. I will tell you, for one of our other shows, Are You Just Watching, still also on noodle.mx or areyoujustwatching.com, it's our critical thinking podcast about movies. That podcast, what I have in my mind is that I will release 2 episodes per month, each episode being about 45 minutes long, 45 minutes to an hour. A problem with just having this ominous number of, or ambiguous number of 2 episodes per month, and also keeping in mind that we record those 2 episodes at the same time, it's just part 1 and part 2 often. What happens, because I'm not on a regular schedule, there's so much that depends on that, like movies that are out at the time or what DVDs are available or the schedule with Eve, my co-host. That all is so many different factors there. And now, especially being married, it's a lot harder. It's going to be a lot harder to devote that time to it. But because it's monthly and it's not on a predetermined date within the month, it's a lot harder to keep up with that and keep 2 episodes per month. I struggle with that because I'm not being true to this advice that I'm giving you right now, and that is get on a schedule and stick to it and be consistent. If you do a weekly podcast, it's a lot easier to do, especially if you schedule it. Schedule your weekly podcasts. That is my number 1 advice to you. If you want to try and podcast weekly or consistently, make it weekly and schedule it. Bi-weekly is a little bit hard to do sometimes. You can forget to produce your content. Weekly becomes a regular thing. Monday nights are now podcast night here at the Noodle Mix Network headquarters, which is my basement. Monday night is when I record. I record the Ramen Noodle, which is my comedy podcast, at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can check it out live. And I now record the Audacity podcast at 8:30 p.m. on Monday nights. It used to be a separate night, but I decided to put all of them at one night. It's so much easier to be consistent with the content when I'm podcasting every week at a consistent time and scheduling it like that. So how frequently should you podcast? Because we have to answer that question before we decide how long should each of your podcasts be. How frequently should you podcast? Well, I recommend I recommend weekly or bi-weekly or daily. I don't recommend monthly because it's really hard to be consistent with it. And I don't recommend more than daily. I know some people that have an odd, like semi-weekly schedule. It's a little bit weird, but they probably have their reasons for it, for releasing shows on odd days within the week. And a lot of times that might be depending on your content. If you produce a show about a TV show, then you might have an initial reactions episode immediately after the TV show airs. And then you might have a podcast later in the week discussing that episode in much more detail. So how frequently should you podcast? It depends on your content. If you're producing content that is based on TV shows, which are weekly, then you should do your podcast weekly. If you're doing episodes on information that doesn't change, like movie reviews, book reviews, regular conversations or interviews, stuff that isn't time sensitive, then you could consider bi-weekly or maybe even monthly. But again, it can be hard to be consistent if you're doing it monthly. If you want to be absolutely cutting edge with news and releasing things so timely that you stand out as the authority on that subject because you release your thoughts and you discover the news and you share your thoughts and share this news almost at the same time as everyone else, you are releasing stuff on the day of or day after it happens. If you want to be that person, then you should podcast daily. Otherwise, I think podcasting weekly or bi-weekly is really easy. It's easy to schedule just a single day. It's easy to be consistent with that. And it's easy to build up a following as people get to know that, just like their favorite TV shows, although, yeah, now there's DVR where they can record it and watch it at their convenience. But hey, that's what a podcast is too, isn't it? People download it and listen to it at their convenience. Don't have to think about things being live, but if you do it live, definitely stick to a schedule. When you record weekly, you can have a lot of options as far as content to you. You've got a whole week to prepare your content. You've got a whole week of content to produce or find. If you do a news podcast, like there's This Week in Tech is, guess what? Weekly. Oh, that was hard to figure out, wasn't it? It's weekly. Yeah, it's weekly. And they talk about tech news from the last week. That's pretty easy because it gives them lots of time to see what's going on and record their thoughts. And it's a regular time, so all of the co-hosts can get together. Several other podcasts I listen to, like some of the podcasts from, or all of the podcasts from GSPN are recorded weekly. GSPN.TV are recorded weekly. And some of that content isn't necessarily time sensitive. Some of it is. They have certain tech shows where they talk about tech news, or especially Apple announcements or podcasting news and TV show episodes. It's all timely. If you podcast daily, then you either have to be right on top of things and be podcasting every single day, which might be a lot of time commitment for you. Not sure if you want to put out that kind of commitment starting off. Or you could pre-record a bunch of episodes and release it throughout the week if the episodes do not have to be so time sensitive. This is what Leo Laporte and Dick DeBartolo do in the GizWiz over at twit.tv, a member of the Twit network, This Week in Tech, is they pre-record all of their GizWiz, daily GizWiz episodes, but then they just release them on each day. So they know what day they were recording for, and then they release them on that day. Just like I talked about previously on how to pre-record episodes, is they do that in that they know what day they're on, what day it will release, and what day they're supposed to pretend it is, like Friday or Saturday or Thanksgiving or whatever. So how long should your podcast be? Like I said, between 1 and 90 minutes. That 90-minute mark, be very careful around there. If you get anywhere above an hour, be very, very careful. You better be providing some very good content if you're going to go above an hour. And if you are monthly, you can get away with a bit more content, but I don't necessarily recommend it because once a month, someone will be hit with 90 minutes of content. I don't like podcasts over an hour. In fact, I will tell you, I have unsubscribed from most of the Twit network podcasts, Leo Laporte's podcasts, because they are so stinking long. I see them download, like MacBreak Weekly downloads. It's 2.5 hours. I'm not going to listen to that. I don't have the time to listen to 2.5 hours from one episode in a week. If I fall behind in a month, then how much time do I have to catch up on? 10 hours of content. I don't want to catch up on 10 hours of just one podcast in 4 episodes. If it's 10 episodes, that's okay. If it's 20 episodes, that's even easier. If you do a weekly or bi-weekly show, I think the sweet spot is 30 to 60 minutes. So somewhere in there, the Audacity podcast, I try to keep around 30 minutes. That's my goal. If it goes over, that's okay, but no longer than 45 minutes. Are You Just Watching is about 45 minutes to an hour. The Ramen Noodle is usually almost exactly an hour, except if you download this week's episode, that's episode 51, theramenoodle.com/51, is where my wife and I told funny stories about our honeymoon and the whole process of getting to our honeymoon and our car breaking down and a lot of funny and embarrassing things happening in the process. We had a lot of fun telling the story, and there were a lot of things to tell in that story. So we went overtime. Yeah, I think we recorded about an hour and 25 minutes. But it was one of our best episodes I think we've had in a while, and we had some really funny stories, some great content. We had a great time, and I think our people will really enjoy that, and time will go by when people are having fun. Now, I think it's okay to release a longer episode like that because I don't do that all the time. For a weekly podcast, I recommend half an hour to an hour. If you're going to do a daily podcast, then I recommend 1 to 15 minutes. Keep it short because you want it to be easy to catch up on. At most, maybe half an hour if you have just a lot of content that can't be broken up. And by can't be broken up, I mean you've got a whole string of a single thought that totally can't be broken up, such as the Focus on the Family podcast, which is just their regular daily broadcast, or even any of the talk shows that also release their episodes online for download that try to pretend to be a podcast. Any of those, it's a lot of content that you listen to every day. Well, being about half an hour for the Focus on the Family episodes, they're really easy to listen to. Even if I get behind a few days, they're really easy to listen to because they split them up logically, and they're about half an hour long. And I find that those seem to go by faster than equal time split up in different episodes, like 3 10-minute episodes versus 1 30-minute episode. So if you're going to do a daily podcast, I highly recommend it be between 5 and 15 minutes, or even it can be 1 minute, but it's hard to get your content in just 1 minute. Ask a Ninja does it. There are other podcasts that are extremely short, 90 seconds or so, and they do it well. There's the 60-second science from some organization. I can't remember who puts that out. There's also The Onion Daily Radio News. That's kind of funny, although a little explicit at times. But it's a funny podcast. That is about a minute, sometimes even less than a minute. It's a daily podcast. The Woot.com podcast used to be weekly, or used to be daily, and each episode was about 5 to 7 minutes. And at one point they said that's their target, is 3 to 7 minutes, somewhere around there. Now they've switched to a weekly format and doing videos, and their videos are a bit longer. When you go from daily to weekly, you can do things a bit longer. And it also gives you the chance to produce things a little bit more. Try not to get a weird schedule, though. Unless that's just the way it has to be, or you have a very good reason for it. But if you just decide, I'm going to release 2 episodes a week, and I'm going to record them on this day and this day for no reason in particular, well, have a reason for it. It's really good to have reasons for the things that you do. I'm the type that I'm definitely a critical thinker, so I'm constantly thinking critically about things. Often I'll see people do something, and I just ask myself in my mind, why do they do that? What reason could they possibly have for doing that? And many times if I were to ask them, though, the answer would be, I don't know. I don't really have a reason. Have a reason for why you do things, how often you do things, and how long you keep things. If your content starts going really long, maybe you need to consider cutting it off, splitting it into parts. It's okay to record a long episode and split it into parts. That's what I did with my interview with Fred Castaneda, episodes 13 and 14. We just had a great conversation, and I realized at some point that this is going to be longer than 45 minutes, so I'll just let it be longer and split it up into 2 parts. The same thing always happens with Are You Just Watching? We'll sit down, and sometimes I'll tell Eve, my co-host, I'll say, I don't think we've got enough content for 2 episodes. I think this might end up just being a single part episode in 45 minutes. When we start talking about these things and discussing philosophies and theologies and worldviews and such and critical thinking, we discover the time goes by really fast. And before we know it, I see on my recorder that 45-minute mark and oops, okay, it's time. Now, I don't say oops in the podcast, but sometimes we joke about how we've used up our time so quickly. But I do in that podcast, I do within the recording, I make the break. I don't just record an hour and a half and then try and find a place to split it. That can be a little hard at times. But in Are You Just Watching, I do verbally split it. I say, well, I think we've had enough for this episode, or we've run out of our time for this episode. That way we can break it up, release episodes more frequently, and so people won't get an hour and a half long episode or a 2-hour long episode. So break things up if you need to. So how frequently should you podcast? I recommend weekly or bi-weekly. Daily, if you really want to be on top of things and if you've got the time to invest in the production of stuff. But weekly seems to be pretty good, or bi-weekly. How long should your podcast be? I think 30 or 45 minutes is a perfect length. Around an hour is okay too. Perfect length, though, for a weekly podcast. 5 to 15 minutes for a daily podcast. Now, you can break these rules if you have a good reason. Just like Keira Knightley's character in Pirates of the Caribbean, the first one said. She said, well, hang the code and hang the rules. They're more like guidelines anyway. And that's exactly the point. What I'm sharing with you are not rules. These are guidelines. And these guidelines are highly influenced by my opinion. Twit has thousands, probably millions of subscribers. So they have many more faithful people who are willing to listen to a 2.5-hour episode. I'm not. I've got too many other podcasts I listen to and stuff that even some of you, my listeners, produce that I listen to and enjoy and love helping you guys get even better with your content. So how long should it be? It's up to you. How frequently? It's up to you. It just all depends on your content. I hate to be so relative like that, but it really is up to you. The main thing is have a good reason for it and stick to that. Don't have a 5-minute episode one week and a 2-hour episode the next week, unless that's your format for some weird reason. Now I want to also share with you a little Audacity quick tip. Because here at the Audacity podcast, I talk a lot about Audacity, and this episode wasn't all about Audacity, but I do want to share some Audacity know-how with you. When you have your recording into the computer, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it's okay. You can do it. There are many ways that you can work around it and avoid some of the problems that people face when recording into the computer directly in. But when you're recording into the computer, sometimes Audacity can get a little confused about where it's supposed to play the sound and where it's supposed to record the sound. And you can go into the preferences to change this. So if you're on a Mac, go to the Audacity menu and click Preferences. If you're on Windows, go to the File or Edit menu to click Preferences. I'm on a Mac now, so I've kind of forgotten a little bit of the Windows side. It's under the Edit menu, usually is on Windows programs. Go into the Devices section, and you can change your playback device and your recording device. This is also where you can record in either mono or stereo. But it's kind of cumbersome to go into your preferences or check that before you start your recording or before you start your playback or whatever. It's annoying to have to go back and forth between the preferences. There's a way that you can see this much easier, and that is This is, remember, Audacity 1.3.12, the version I recommend. It's the latest version. Definitely get the 1.3 beta, especially you Windows 7 users. Go to the View menu, go to Toolbars, and click on Device Toolbar. This one is off by default. Turn it on. When you turn it on, you'll discover a new toolbar with a little speaker icon, and you'll see two drop-down lists. There's a speaker icon and a microphone icon. And these two drop-downs are your output and input devices, respectively. So I'm looking at my Audacity right now, and I see when I click the output section, I have my built-in output and I have my USB audio codec. That's my USB bridge that is connected to my computer with the mixer. And that is how I get my audio into my computer. Now I record into a second device, not my computer itself, but I broadcast through my computer, so I need to get the audio in somehow. So when I play audio from my computer into the recording, I play it through USB audio codec. So this is where you can change your output, and then the little microphone is where you change your input. So on my Mac, I have built-in microphone, built-in input, USB audio codec, and actually a couple others that have been added through software. On your computer, you might have line in, microphone in, you might have optical in. You could have all sorts of options in there. This is a quick way that you can see where you're recording from before you start to record. And you can switch where you're recording from as well. So if you decide that instead of using the internal microphone, you're going to plug in a USB microphone, you plug it in, and Audacity's still recording from the internal microphone, we'll just click on this little drop down and switch your audio inputs. Sometimes, depending on your computer and the hardware you're using, you might have to restart Audacity for the devices to show up in that menu, but they will be there if you click in the drop down. So again, that is, go to the View menu in Audacity for Windows or Mac or even Linux. Go to Toolbars and then click Device Toolbar to reveal the device toolbar. And that will help you be able to switch your input or output devices for your recording. So I hope that this has been beneficial for you. If you want to send in a question or comment or share something about your podcasting journey, send that to feedback@noodle.mx or call in to 859-353-4332. I've got a lot of messages to go through, and I haven't been able to finish organizing them all yet into different shows. So I know many of you have emailed me, and I will be responding to those. It's just taking a little bit longer because of all the messages I've got in there. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. Check out the other shows on the Noodle Mix Network. Follow me on twitter.com/theramennoodle. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. I'm your host, Daniel Lewis. Thanks for listening.